Hello, my name's Dr. Phil Davies. Now, would you like to save the famous Outer Space Treaty to keep us all safe from aggressive weaponization of space, especially the orbital space just 350 kilometers above our heads? And would you love to provide your family descendants with a real opportunity to own a huge chunk of land on planet Mars? Now, if that's a yes, then do something amazing and join the Martians. Join the Martians in our communal claim of possession of the land on Mars. Now, this claim of possession has been validated by some of the most respected legal experts in the world. Now, you don't believe that? Well, keep listening. So who are the Martians? Well, that's us. We're all humankind, or rather an equitable representation of all humankind. We have people joining us from all 195 countries and counting in equitable numbers. We say it's a pan-multinational communal claim. Now, this claim is twinned with our Save the Outer Space Treaty campaign. And we say join the Martians to save the Earth. Now, that probably sounds vacuous and stupid right now, but in 100 years' time, that could be a matter of fact. So how come? Well, because we are now offering an elegant, flat-packed prefab solution to most of the legal needs and concerns that are facing our future use of space, the moon, and especially planet Mars. Now, the governments of all spacefaring nations really do need this flat-pack solution. It can work with and really enhance pre-existing laws and agreements, such as the Outer Space Treaty and the Artemis Accords. So how can we have solved the difficult legal problems that are now facing spacefaring nations when national delegations meet every year at the United Nations? The committee is called COPUOS, the Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. But they haven't managed to get very far in 55 years since the original Outer Space Treaty in 1967. Well, it's because we're not blinkered. We are outside that cauldron and have come from a different angle. So what are we doing? And how are we doing it? And why are we doing it? Okay, so in 2010, I was still working in an aeromedical setting, and I was getting into astronomy at the time. I became aware of the vulnerability of the Outer Space Treaty 1967. This was an amazing law that was created in 1967 and is the only law to effectively guard against aggressive weaponization, especially nuclear weaponization in space. Now, this law is becoming progressively weakened, mainly because it was seen as bad for business. Now, the Outer Space Treaty was an amazing treaty, signed by many nations, but primarily concerning the United States and USSR, Russia. It was set up to prevent a nuclear arms race in space and to stop celestial land grabbing by either nation. They were thinking of the moon, really, at that time. Now, it did a great job for these issues, but as our space capability has improved, it's become clear that it's not very helpful, not really fit for purpose for nations and companies who want to go to the moon and asteroids to mine it for resources. So eventually, the Americans, having been stalled by this problem in the Outer Space Treaty for many years, they developed an independent national space law in 2015. It's called the US Space Act, but it has a longer title, the US Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act. Now, it says effectively that US miners can mine celestial resources and can own, use, and sell these resources. And the Luxembourg national space law has kind of copycatted that for Europe. Following that, the new Artemis Accords. These are bilateral agreements between the United States and other countries individually. The Artemis Accords are another workaround arrangement that will serve to strengthen this US viewpoint and the US Space Act. the more signatories and the more strength it has. Now, like I said, there's 195 nations, and there are only 20 signatories so far. And some big spacefaring nations have not yet signed. Of course, Russia and China, but also India and Germany. Now, perhaps they will, but that's the situation as it is right now. Now, for as long as the US Space Act and the Artemis Accords have significant numbers of nations in opposition, as it does now, then the space treaty itself becomes weakened by that tension. And perhaps the biggest problem is that neither the US Space Act or the Artemis Accords address Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is the core law of space, and Article 1 is all about sharing the product of exploitation and use of resources. And that's a big issue. It was that hurdle that primarily is the downfall for the Moon Agreement, which was a treaty developed in 1979. But the US Space Act and the Artemis Accords do not afford for that. And that is potentially a showstopper. It's a big issue. Now, we have a plan that deals with that. But more on the space treaty. It is further weakened by the current wishes of spacefaring nations to weaponize space, albeit peacefully weaponize space to protect space assets initially. But let's remember, all defensive weapons are really attack weapons. Now, this ambition to weaponize space may seem like a small step. It's already militarized, but it's actually a giant leap for mankind in the wrong direction. Across the Rubicon, it is very difficult to see how this weaponization can sit comfortably with the Outer Space Treaty, which talks of peaceful uses only and advises that all astronauts are to be praised and protected as envoys of mankind. Now, that's going to be difficult if they all have assault rifles and are on different sides. Even the world's best Air Force, Great Britain's Royal Air Force, has in its latest recruitment campaign a video showing a servicewoman ascending into space carrying her assault rifle, with the voiceover saying, "Try protecting space." Now, I understand the need to project strength and to maintain operational capability, but let's not sleepwalk into aggressive weaponization of space unless it really is necessary. This weaponization will definitely damage and weaken the Outer Space Treaty further. And the problem with having a weakened treaty is that it becomes easier for nations to pull out of a discredited, not fit for purpose treaty. And sooner or later, there will then be nuclear weapons sitting 300 kilometers above our heads, pointing down. Not ideal, you've got to say. So, in 2010, I recognized that the Outer Space Treaty needed a makeover. It was a child of its time, amazing, but now needed to become fit for purpose for the modern age. It's too important to open and edit. The elements within it are important, they're just a little bit woolly. But that, of course, lends itself as a good base for further law building. And that's what we hope for. Further, smaller, explicit top-up agreement or treaty with explicit articles preventing aggressive weaponization, no strike weapons, allowing and encouraging vibrant space commerce. In other words, fully legalizing the mining and use of resources responsibly. And of course, ensuring responsible debris and waste management. That's also important right now. Such a small top-up agreement, maybe non-binding, but preferably binding in a treaty, could allow for a wonderful, safe future for space exploitation and exploration. And bear in mind, space exploitation is probably what will drive all exploration and may ultimately provide great benefit for planet Earth. Now, just campaigning and lobbying for updates in space law is never going to work. It's a dry subject. It sounds boring. It fails to inspire public imagination. I know. Uh, and we can see that the UN has already been trying to do something like this for years and has failed so far in 53 years. At the very least, we need to conjure up a jolt to sting the UN into more cohesive action, or better still, create a legal situation whereby spacefaring nations and the United Nations are compelled to agree to such an update in space law. So that is what I started aiming for in 2010 and have continued ever since for more than 12 years. I based a claim to Mars land possession on the use of very powerful lasers aligned to astronomical telescopes targeting Mars on a frequent basis. Now, at times, when Mars is close, at opposition, closest approach, we are smashing Mars with more than 10 quadrillion photons per second. Now, Earth and Mars meet up closely every 26 months. So the time in between, there's a variable distance, and sometimes Mars isn't targetable. But on average, we are hitting Mars twice a week for 20 weeks a year. Now, this persistent targeting of Mars has only a very small effect on the surface and atmosphere of Mars, including the release of carbon dioxide molecules from the surface into the atmosphere. Now, this effect and influence is tiny, probably way too small to really call a controlling influence. Nevertheless, we've persisted with this for over 12 years. And during this time, we have used the use of lasers to justify a claim of factual possession of land on Mars. And we have developed a compelling project strategy, including an ethical governance plan for the management of the land claimed. Now, the full realization of that strategy would or will deliver on all our goals, including that top-up agreement to bolster and develop existing space law, to keep us all safe primarily. So we claim factual possession of land on Mars using lasers without having set foot on Mars. Now, how can this be so? Does space law not prevent stuff like this? Well, no, it prevents ownership. Right now, it is not legally possible to own land in space or to hold real deeds to celestial land. Now, we know there are agencies that since the late 1980s have been selling such deeds, but they, of course, are stamped in small print as novelty items. Now, if they were sold as real, it would not be legal. You'd be looking at fraudulent activity. Their actions are questionable, but possession is very different. It's a factual thing, and it is legal. In international law and in national common law, those nations that base their legal system on the common law system, possession is the usual prerequisite for sovereignty and ownership over new or unregistered land. Now, possession over open areas of rather barren land on Earth has been legally satisfied without having any human settlement or activity within that claimed area. Examples are Greenland, islands like Las Palmas and Clipperton, and also all those Antarctic claims that were put in place, like Great Britain and France, over areas of Antarctica before the Antarctic Treaty put all those claims on ice. But we know you just can't take my word for something like this. We need expert opinions on all of this in order to validate what we're saying. Now, I'm not an astrophysicist, and I'm not an expert scholar in international law. I'm a medical doctor, so I'm no use in this matter. So we have engaged with some of the world's most respected experts in astrophysics and international law. Now, with respect to this science, we and you both need to know that we are indeed doing exactly what we are saying we are doing with the lasers. Are we targeting Mars correctly? We slightly anticipate Mars velocity when we target the planet. We assume light reciprocity, reversibility, retracing its path, at higher angles in the sky. We calculate the number of photons reaching the surface of Mars, bearing in mind deflections that can happen both in Earth's atmosphere and to a certain degree in the Martian dusty atmosphere. But are those calculations correct? We contacted several astrophysicists and they provided email answers, but we wanted more than that. So we actually commissioned one of the world's top experts to do a more complete independent report. We targeted an American astrophysicist, Dr. Paul Sutter. He's a professor at Stony Brook University in New York City and the Flatiron Institute. Now, he's gaining profile in the United States as an expert presenter on the Weather Channel, Discovery Channel, and Science Channel. And he runs a very highly popular podcast, Ask a Spaceman. Now, we approached him and he provided a full report. And indeed, his calculations agreed with our approximate calculations, especially for our red laser use. I think we rather overestimated the impact of our blue lasers. But broadly speaking, we were agreed. Now, together with other astrophysicists, he stated that the resultant effect, such as CO2 release, would be very small and currently too small to measure. Again, we agreed with that. We were delighted to have this validation of our estimates and calculations. However, it's worth saying that some of these astrophysicists, including Dr. Paul Sutter and also Professor Ben Moore of the University of Zurich, were very surprised, perhaps shocked, to learn that legal experts might actually consider this persistent use of laser to be sufficient to rightly claim factual possession over Martian land. In other words, not requiring boots on the ground. But law is not their specialty. Theirs is the science. So it's over to the legal experts for that. Now, I should say that if you're interested in science, you can drill into the equations and calculations of our expert witness on our science page on the website. But all of the world's top scholars of international law are aware of this project. Now, they have looked at our use of lasers and the impact that might have on the law, and also looked at our strategy and governance plans. So this is a good time to tell you about the strategy and governance plans. These are based on the eventuality of us becoming successful in registering ownership of land on Mars. So that's a leap ahead, but let's assume that. Should we be successful in claiming ownership of land on Mars, perhaps 50 to 100 years' time, we would like that ownership to be split. In common law, ownership is a split bundle of rights. And we would like the legal title to go to all humankind and to be held in trust by a United Nations body. A famous UK professor in the 1960s, Professor Jenks, already proposed that the United Nations could own celestial land in the solar system on behalf of all mankind. That's what we want. Registration of legal title and ownership over land on Mars to go to all humankind, held in trust by the United Nations. But we talked about a split bundle of rights. The beneficial title, which includes financial gain, should go to all our co-claimants, everybody who joins us in this communal claim to land on Mars. Now, if successful, the land will be split into smaller plots, ranging from 9 square kilometers to 35 square kilometers. The average is 25 square kilometers. Very big plots of land, and allocated by random lottery to our membership. Every member will get a plot. Now, our membership is distributed ethically and equitably. How so? Well, half of all claims are open to anyone, regardless of where you come from. The other half of all claims are divided and apportioned to nations according to their human rights and state corruption statistics, as well as their national population. Now, we have 5.4 million claims available in total, and we believe that we have distributed them equitably to reflect all humanity, as well as giving a nod towards commercialism, which ultimately will drive all space exploitation and exploration. So we will have an equitable distribution of a representation of humanity owning the beneficial title to land on Mars. Now, how might that be useful? Well, we also want the establishment of a pro-business space user group. This is something that could come out of, say, the Artemis Accords. It is the space users using land on Mars that we want to govern the use and exploitation of that land. But we want representation on that vital space user group to be only available to those nations who agree to sign and ratify the top-up agreement that we want in order to reinforce existing space law, to help the Outer Space Treaty stop aggressive weaponization, to help it mitigate and manage space debris, and to encourage and facilitate vibrant trade and resource mining. Now, in that situation, the space user group will sign off the responsible contracts for the space mining companies. Those companies can then raise finance and then can build their installations on Mars. They only have to pay a ground rent, a reasonable ground rent to the affected claimant landowner. They then can keep all their profits, obviously paying taxes to their parent nation, but that leads to vibrant, profitable commerce, and it's predictable for the purposes of raising finance. So where does the sharing come into it? Well, that's for the landowners. The affected landowner must part share that land rent with all other co-claimants. And given that all co-claimants are an equitable representation of all humanity, that effectively means that all humanity benefits from the exploitation, thus satisfying Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. A very elegant, flat-packed solution, we think. Now, like I say, all legal experts are aware of our project, but we particularly approached a small cadre of the most elite, and 3 of them have given us very informative responses by way of reports. So the first one of these elite experts was Professor Frans van der Donk. Now, he is the longest serving director of the International Institute of Space Law. He is also eminent professor at the University of Nebraska, perhaps America's most elite university dealing in space law. He is the owner of and operator of the world's leading space law consultancy, termed Black Holes. He is the author of the leading handbook in space law. He was the keynote speaker for US Space Command's inaugural Space Law Conference. And he also led the International Institute of Space Law in 2 position papers that annihilated all those online purveyors of fake or novelty deeds to land on the moon and Mars. He is pro-commercial in the sense that he feels the Artemis Accords are workable and a good thing. And indeed, if you search for the Artemis Accords on Wikipedia, it is his legal report and legal quotes that you see on that page. Now, he provided two reports, but the pivotal report he provided us with was a 13-page document called the Legal Reality Check Report. Now, he obviously confirms that space law currently bars all ownership of celestial land, period. That cannot currently happen. But of course, he acknowledges that space law is a young law and is certainly not written in stone. It can change in future, and we absolutely expect it to change in future. But he stated that what we are doing with lasers and with our strategy is entirely legal and interesting and perhaps very beneficial. He says that we can rightfully claim factual possession, or at least embryonic factual possession of land on Mars. Now, he said if the law were to change, as we expect it will do one day, towards the acceptance of private property rights on Mars and on the Moon, then our claim, as it stands, would be first in line for consideration of ownership. Now, that's great news. First in line. But that doesn't automatically mean that we would get ownership. We get first consideration. As he said, the claim may be assessed as embryonic, in which case it would need to get stronger. And we agree with that. It does need to get stronger. But this gives us a starting point to the possession of Mars. 2010. Nobody else has that. That's fantastic. But we wanted to reinforce his report. He was a world expert, but it is standing alone. We needed more. So we approached Dr. Philip Davies. Now, he is the rapporteur of the International Law Association's Space Law Committee. He is a highly respected author, lecturer, and critic in this field. Now, he produced a 10-page report, and it looked at Professor von der Dunk's report and also looked at our strategy and drilled into our governance plans. Now, he says, and his report stated, that our persistent actions with powerful lasers applied to Mars are slightly more impactful than symbolic acts that some nations may deliver, dropping insignia or planting flags on celestial land. But he still assessed overall that our actions were largely symbolic, and yet still enough to feasibly create a provisional inchoate title. Inchoate meaning rudimentary or incomplete. In other words, if the law were to favorably evolve to tolerate such property rights in space, as we think it will, then as they stand, we have created an inchoate title, an incomplete ownership, which would need to be completed or perfected in a reasonable period of time. By completion, it means establishing full, unequivocal possession, likely human settlement on the land. But this report gives us a provisional legal foothold on Mars and really folds in very nicely with Professor von der Dunk's report. Now, nobody else has got such a legal provisional foothold on Mars. Nobody else. NASA, USA, European Space Agency, EU, China, Russia, SpaceX. None have combined any potential possessory activity, and there certainly has been some activity that could count as possessory activity, but none have been combined with a claim of possession or ownership. So thus we stand alone. So Professor von der Dunk and then Dr. Philip Davies also went to great lengths to show the difference between our legitimate and ethical project compared to the ridiculous and nefarious activity of those sellers of novelty deeds. And that was put in writing, and we're pleased to exhibit that. This was all followed up then by a brief report by email from Professor P.J. Blount. This was very gratefully received. P.J. is a professor from the University of Mississippi in the United States. This is the other greatest US university that deals with space law. He's also a lecturer at the University of Cardiff in the UK now. He is also the treasurer of the International Institute of Space Law and carries great authority. Now, in his email, he stated that he could see no red flags in what we were doing. In a separate newspaper interview that he had already given, he had declared his support for our ethical project's goals. And then again, in this email to us, he stated that he could see no legal issues with what we were doing. And he felt that we could argue for factual possession. He himself didn't feel that we had quite done enough to establish factual possession, but he felt it was flexible and that we could argue that. So therefore, all three reports coalesce around the fact that we can argue for early factual possession. And we're very pleased to know that. Now, such possession can or cannot, as already stated, be converted into ownership within the current law. But we expect that to happen. And when it does, we should be first in line. This is unique. No other persons or agencies can claim that. Why do we expect the law to change? Well, whilst we can do something to influence that, it is more likely that the law will come to tolerate property rights at a time when settlement and trading of resources is easier and more widespread on celestial land, starting with the moon. This is highly likely. The Artemis Accords are a workaround. Once you have established settlements on Mars and on the moon, it is highly likely that people will want to own that land and care for that land. And ownership, we suspect, will be facilitated. Ultimately, the driver for the Antarctic Treaty was primarily the fact that settlement wasn't easily possible at the time. So Antarctica was put on freeze until such time as settlement can be facilitated and resources are important enough to retrieve. Now, the Antarctic Treaty is due for review in under 30 years' time, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. But we strongly suspect that when it becomes feasible on a larger scale to settle and mine the moon, then celestial land property rights will become tolerated. And in that case, we're first in line. So what next? Do we just wait for that law to evolve in that manner? I mean, that could take 50 to 100 years, perhaps longer. And we have to admit, it may not happen. Space and celestial land might remain a global commons for always. We doubt it will. Look what we've done with the oceans. We don't really care for global commons terribly well. But actually, there are things that we can do to instigate an earlier change in the law in that direction. Because for our project to be fully realized, there is no need to rewrite existing space law. Core space law can remain intact. The Outer Space Treaty and indeed the Artemis Accords can stay as they are. There only needs to be some relatively small reinterpretation of existing written law in order to allow for our project to be fully realized. Now, that includes the international registration of ownership of title on Mars to all humankind and the beneficial title to go to our claimants. But that does not necessarily affect individual national sovereignty. So, there needs to be some reinterpretation of existing law. And the state delegations at Copious, or where such reinterpretation could really be agreed, and certainly lobbying those state delegations one by one is something we plan to do over the next 10 years. We believe that we can lead them to understand the full potential benefits of our flat pack solution to those legal problems we face. But of course, copyist is not the only route to such international agreement, as proven with the Artemis Accords. They are a set of bilateral agreements between the US and other nations, so far 20. Now, they were agreed outside the UN. Not everyone's happy with that, but it's understandable because UN committees move so slowly via 100% consensus. Now, that sort of setup is quite good at resolving arguments, but it's not great for getting things done. If one state delegation doesn't like a motion or a proposal, it probably won't happen. So things happen slowly. Now, that might change, but we can see why the Artemis Accords needed to develop and grow outside of the UN. It's a non-legally binding agreement and it applies only to the signatories concerned. Now, our solution could be adopted via copyists, but perhaps more readily adopted in a similar manner to the Artemis Accords. In fact, it truly enhances the Artemis Accords in a favorable sense. It gifts the Artemis Accords the ability to observe Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, while still encouraging vibrant, responsible trade. Without this, all ongoing plans for space exploitation and mining via the Space Act and the Artemis Accords do not accommodate Article 1. This is the sharing principle. Now, this is potentially a massive problem and even a showstopper. It could certainly hold up space commerce even further, and it could spell the end to the Outer Space Treaty. It risks it being dropped by those nations who become exasperated with stalling. And that would leave a risky Wild West approach to space exploitation, where weaponization, including nuclear weaponization, is rife. Now, our elegant, flat-packed solution that the project we have delivers will be invaluable to spacefaring nations who want confidence to raise investment for those big space mining projects. It will also be invaluable for these people and nations who really value peace and stability. It will be invaluable for those non-spacefaring nations as yet, who would otherwise be left behind. The corporations who wish to engage in space mining and exploitation will also love it. Their profits can stay with them. They don't need to be shared. It's the landowners who do the sharing. Business can be predictable. Finance can be raised for such projects. All humankind is the owner of the legal title to Mars with our arrangement. The space user group could feasibly evolve from the existing Artemis Accords, and we see a need for this pro-business and responsible space user group to govern exploitation of Mars. Now, we have said that we would wish for only those nations who ratify a new top-up space agreement or treaty preferentially. Only they could be represented on this space user group. Now, individual nations, very much like the Artemis Accords, could agree to provisionally register the validity of our claim. Provisionally register it in order to show intent to engage with our proposed legal solution. Now, this could later progress, hopefully, via COPUOS, Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space at the UN, or the UN General Assembly, towards the full implementation of our project, resulting in the international registration of legal title into ownership of all humankind and the beneficial title going to our co-claimants, as stated before. Now, both Professor Frans van der Dunk and Professor Philip Davies have both given examples of all this could work. So the reports are worth studying. So yeah, the effective lobbying of state departments and state delegations to the UN will be a significant part of our efforts over the next 10 years. But this route to legal acceptance is not the only route we can take. In fact, perhaps more important is increasing the physical possessory connection to Mars. Now, we have a big plan for that. So where are we now? And what are the next steps? We're now ready to go commercial. We really haven't to date. Over the last 12 years, certainly for the first 6 years, we were exclusively free. People could join with us as co-claimants for free. Now, since 2016, there was an option to join via paid membership, and we promoted that occasionally when we needed to raise funds for legal fees, going through UK courts, getting legal opinions, expert analysis. But predominantly people have joined us for free. And yet it is the small number of fee-paying claimants that have actually proved the most motivated. We did some internal audit and found that it was those that were more motivated to become influencers and advocates for the Martians and its plans. So yeah, we're now ready to increase our membership, striving for 5.4 million. 5 million being paid for, 400,000 being free. Now, we're ready to re-engage with knowledgeable world media, not tabloid media at this stage. We need them to understand our project and the legal solution that it offers to spacefaring nations. We need them to get that message out in a fair and balanced way. We need them to understand the key difference between possession and ownership. They are not the same. This has been a big point of confusion for media over the last few years, and it leads to huge misinterpretation. Possession is a factual phenomenon and is entirely legal, as stated by all those expert lawyers. Ownership of celestial land is not currently legal, not legal. Now, the difference between us and all those nefarious sellers of fake or novelty deeds needs to be stressed and understood before we go big in the public environment. We think that the knowledgeable media can help with that. And maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe that will be so successful that we don't need marketing spend. But we suspect we will need that. And so we will need seed funding. Now, ideally, that seed funding will be packaged with an investor who brings modern marketing skills, or perhaps a prominent business angel who has widespread public appeal. Ideally, this investor will stay with us the full course, the full journey, but we have to allow for a more likely, profitable early exit route. And that can easily be facilitated in our business strategy. The business costs for us, being an online-based company, is initially minimal. Marketing is likely to be the biggest spend. Now we're offering 5.4 million claim certificates, of which 400,000 will be free. That will be honored. That's 5 million paid memberships. Now, currently the national claims under nationality, are promoted most at just £14, roughly $18. But as membership grows, that price will slowly climb, such that when we have sold 5 million memberships, we will have a massive financial war chest. And we will use that wisely, reinvested to strengthen our possession. We should say at this point that we plan to associate membership certification with non-fungible tokens, such that when these memberships become more valuable in future, they can be traded and passed on to other people. And in the course of that transfer, 10% of that transfer fee comes back to us using non-fungible tokens. That leads to a secondary market, which we can also reinvest those funds into strengthening the claim of possession. at least 20% of our profits will go towards strengthening the claim of possession. And one way of doing that is to offer up annual scholarships in STEM studies and space studies to successful applicants who come from within our members' families. We're potentially looking at up to 100 scholarships a year, not to start with, but that would be the goal. And that will lead to the genesis of multiple subject matter experts who are within our membership and become strong proponents and advocates for our mission. Now, some of those will really progress into the space industry and might even form some of the early space astronauts, miners, engineers, and settlers that actually go to Mars. Now, in order to encourage that, we're making a large financial offering to the first 10 members that actually do arrive and set foot on Mars. Perhaps $1 million each. Now, such a physical presence, boots on ground, could serve to complete and perfect our provisional in Kuwait title, enough to truly establish factual possession beyond doubt, such that then if the law were to evolve towards tolerance of property rights, we would have easily the strongest and most enduring claim for ownership. But there's even more we can do in this effort. We should, at quite an early stage, sometimes shortly after seed investment, agree a memorandum of understanding with a space industry partner, or perhaps more than one. Now, whether this is a partnership with a transportation company, be that SpaceX or Virgin and Galactic even, we know Richard Branson, it's feasible, or perhaps with a well-funded space mining company. Such did exist. You may have heard of companies like Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries. They were relatively short-lived, but they were funded by billionaires. They will come back in new guises and will last longer and perhaps actually will become established. They could make for a very interesting partner. There's certainly something in it for both of us. It would be mutually beneficial. We would have to be very cautious and careful about establishing a working arrangement because we do not want to compromise on our goals. But of course, during the next 10 years, we're also going to be doing some lobbying. Now, it may take 50 to 100 years for all of this to come to fruition, but for the sake of humanity, we hope we can gain provisional agreement with spacefaring nations and space industry elements such that aggressive weaponization does not develop. Finally, I should also mention that 10% of our profits will go to serious efforts to manage and mitigate debris and waste in space. Debris management doesn't, as it stands, look like a financially lucrative option for business. We have to make it so. So all business entities looking access into space should, we feel, set aside a levy to be paid towards mitigation and management of space debris. This is becoming increasingly important, and we would like to help show the way. So that's what we're doing. And I say again, if you really want to help save the Outer Space Treaty, to keep us safe from aggressive weaponization just 300 kilometers above our heads, and if you want to give your family descendants a real opportunity to own a huge chunk of land on Mars, then do something amazing and join the Martians.